This sermon was preached at Crossway Church in Battleground, Washington. It's part of our series, 1 Corinthians, Viewing Life Through the Gospel Lens. We hope that you're challenged and encouraged by it.
Well, last week I kind of hinted at you that Paul is going to be dealing with sexuality for the next couple of weeks. Last week he engaged with 2 Corinthian ideas that they say that basically I can do whatever I want, and sexual desire is just physical, so it has nothing to do with the rest of my life. And that's one of the ditches I would say that we need to avoid when it comes to sexuality. And so he laid out the law that no, sex is more than that. It's an emotional and a spiritual and a physical connection, and so we need to guard it and we need to treasure it. On the other side, I think, is that even Christians sometimes, when they come to texts, can be clear that sexuality is kind of a necessary evil, is almost the way that I would say. I hate to say it that way, but it's basically only necessary for procreation. And in that sense, what they do is they view sex in a negative way, and it's there. And it's sad that that's the case, but I do think as we kind of look at it, that happens. As a matter of fact, what we're going to see is that Paul switches gears in 1 Corinthians. The first part of the letter, he's dealing with issues that he's heard, that people have mentioned and brought forward to him in reports as he's engaged with people from the church. And today, he's actually going to start to respond to statements or questions that the church made and asked for his input. And so you'll see today that he'll say, it matters that you wrote about. And so today he's going to deal with this other area, the one where maybe we don't see the freedom that we have and the beautiful thing that sexuality is in marriage. And so that is what we're going to be looking at today. And so if you want to open up your Bibles, we will be looking at 1 Corinthians 7, 1 through 5. That's what we do here at Crossway. We just preach through a book. And so we'll be camping in Corinthians until I go on sabbatical. And so next week we get to deal with all kinds of different situations, singleness and marriage and all kinds of different things. But Paul's just going to deal with a lot of really practical matters. And so today we're looking at 1 Corinthians 7, and this is the word of the Lord. Now for the matters you wrote about, it's good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman. But since sexual immorality is occurring, each man should have sexual relations with his own wife, and each woman with her own husband. The woman should fulfill his marital duty to his wife, and likewise the wife to her husband. The wife does not have authority over her own body, but yields it to her husband. In the same way, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but yields it to his wife. Do not deprive each other, except for perhaps by mutual consent and for a time, so that you may devote yourselves to prayer. Then come together again so that Satan will not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. Well, last week, actually over the course of the sermon series, I've made it pretty clear that in Corinth, they are a pretty complex town. The way that I've described it, it is the San Francisco gold rush in the midst of everything, or Vegas in its heyday. It was a rich town that got rich because of its spot of where it is and all the commerce that went through it. And it was known for being open to almost anything when it comes to sexuality. And last week we saw, as I said in the two ditches, where they said, hey, I can do whatever I want with my body. My body is just physical. It's a desire. Sexual desires are just like food. And so it doesn't matter what we do. And so far in Corinth, we've seen that there is a man who's sleeping with his wife, or with his father's wife, and others that are sleeping with prostitutes. And so it shows that this is kind of the backdrop on it. But it's complex in the sense that not only is that end of things going, but there's another end as well. And there are people who are overreacting to that and saying, hey, if this is what the rest of the world is going to, well, then maybe we're going to go over here. And the question that they're basically asking in this text is sex bad? Now, last week I hinted at the root of this. It's a thing called Gnosticism, and Gnostics believed that the spiritual was good and the physical was bad and should be avoided. Now, this isn't a Christian thought. This is a Greek thought, and it has roots in Plato and other things, but this idea is something that still has impact. I mean, if you think about it today even, there is this thing where we think anything spiritual is good. I can't tell you how many times when I'm a hospital chaplain, as long as I'm connecting to some kind of spirituality, it must be good. even though the Bible tells us that we need to test the spirits, and so not every spirituality is good. But there's also this image that sometimes our bodies are just bad, and so it needs to be avoided. And we need to look at this, because this isn't a biblical thought. As I said last week, our bodies and our minds and our souls and psyche, or whatever word the Bible uses, different words to describe those things, are intertwined. They can't be separated. And so the Gnostics and the people of Corinth who wrote this and asked Paul about this question are arguing that because sex is spiritual, it's dirty and should be shunned. That's where he says, is it good not for a man to have sexual relations with a woman? That's what they're trying to contend. And basically what they're saying is that husbands and wives should avoid sex because of it. That's what they're arguing. Now, it's easy to kind of pick on them. If I were to ask you guys, hey, how many of you guys are Gnostics? Most of us would say probably not. But we also have to be honest about kind of the way that the church can talk about sex. And I said this last week. Sometimes when we want to talk about it in, hey, save sex for marriage, what we can have is we can create this negative view of sex. And it can have different connotations. And so if we only talk about the don't and we don't talk about the good, then things can happen that we don't really want to. A book by one author, her name is Laura Winner, and she wrote the book Real Sex, says, rather than spending our own unmarried years stewarding and discipling our sexual desires, we become ashamed of them. And we persuade ourselves that desires themselves are horrible, and this can have real consequences if we get married. We can spend years guarding our virginity, but find upon getting married that we can't just flip a switch. Now that sex is listed and sanctioned and even blessed by our community, and I'd say God himself, we are stuck with years of work and sometimes therapy to unlearn a Gnostic anxiety about sex, to learn instead that sex is good. And so a few years ago, they've seen this, that there is a purity culture that really stressed this waiting, but the way that, which is good. That's what we said. God has created sex to be within the confines of marriage. But the way that they talked about it is they shunned all kinds of physical activity that it almost made it seem like any kind of desire is bad. And so today what we're going to see is Paul speaks against that just as bluntly as he speaks against the other. We have to walk this really middle ground of saying this is what sex is and this is a beautiful thing, and we have to learn to curb those desires, but not have it in such a negative way that we think it's bad, because we don't want to burden people with that. And so Paul's response is pretty blunt and to the point. If you've learned anything about Paul in this book, that's exactly the way that he works. Now, right off the bat, I want to say and acknowledge that Paul's language seems a bit clunky to us. Like, I'm sure as I read this, part of you are like, whoa. But I want you to get the heart behind it. Words like fulfill and defraud or those kind of things are kind of loaded. But I think if there's anything that Paul wants us to see is the first thing that he says is when the people say, is it better? Is it more spiritual for us not to have sex? He says, no. Sex should be a regular part of marriage. And he says it, each man should have sexual relations with his own wife, and each woman with her own husband. And I want you to see there that in all of this context right here, that it's not just a one-sided thing. That it's okay for a man to desire sex, and it's okay for a woman to desire sex. And that it should be a regular part of marriage is the way that he phrases things. Now, our culture today, I think, and Hollywood often present sex is this thing that's amazing that you do when you first meet somebody, and it's this awesome thing, and they kind of poo-poo marital sex. I mean, if you listen to almost any sitcom, you'll hear usually a joke like, if you want to kill your sex life, you just get married. I think we need to be honest that this kind of undercurrent is there and not let it kind of have an impact in our own lives, because the Bible paints it in a completely different way. And what it says instead is that sex is tov. Now, what do I mean by tov? T-O-V. It's a Hebrew word that means very good. He says it's very good for a husband and wife to enjoy sexual intimacy. I love this quote by John Mark Comer in Loveology. Now, if there's a book you want to read on relationships, it's a really good one. He says, "We were sexual before we were sinful. Sex is not an evil curse that we have to curb and deny. It's a good gift we get to enjoy as long as it's in the right context." I want you to read that sentence. We were sexual before we were sinful. Like, that's a loaded statement, but it's absolutely true. Because God created sex before the fall. In Genesis 1, 27 and 28, he says, God created mankind in his own image, the image of God. He created them, male and female, he created them. God blessed them and said to them, "Be fruitful and increase in number." Well, how do you be fruitful and increase in number? The way that God created sexuality is for us to do that. I used to joke when I did abstinence talk. I told you about this last week, that when I was in a Christian environment, that God could have had us have babies in all kinds of different ways, I said it this way, if God really wanted to, he could just say, okay, do something stupid, let's both sneeze at the same time, or touch right here, and then we're going to have sex. But he didn't create it that way. He created his sex to be this thing that was a pleasurable thing, an intimate thing between a husband and a wife. And he did it purposely. And so what we need to see here is that God created sex before the fall. That yes, all of our sexuality is distorted by the fall, and we have to wrestle with that, but that it's not a bad thing. It's a good thing. God created it that way. And he created it to be a deep bond between a husband and wife. In Genesis 2, verses 24 and 25, he says it this way: "That is why a man leaves his father and mother and is united with his wife, and they become one flesh. And Adam and his wife were both naked, and they felt no shame." Now, do you see that no shame part? That speaks directly against what the Corinthians were saying. The Corinthians are saying is sexuality is physical, so it's bad. But Genesis and Paul, who quoted this earlier, says, no, sexuality is good. It's a God-created thing. And so it is an important part. Now, that word that is used, the oneness, they became one flesh, when it's combined with flesh, essentially means that they're fused together at the deepest level. It's the melding of two bodies and two souls. It's the physical and the spiritual. And there's no way to split the two. That's the way that God created it to be. The Hebrew word is echad. And it really is this oneness and connectedness. And that's exactly how the Bible envisions sexuality to be. It's created to create this bond between two people. He created it to be a vulnerable thing where you open yourself up to your spouse, and it's supposed to be a beautiful thing. And we need to talk about it in those kind of terms. We also see that the Bible blesses spirituality after the fall. The Song of Songs, or the Song of Solomon, is literally an erotic love poetry between a husband and wife. Now, I got to admit, it's not exactly going to make any Valentine's Day cards. I mean, it's written in a context of a bunch of shepherds and people living that kind of life, because he says, "How beautiful are you, my darling? Oh, how beautiful. Your eyes are a veil of doves." Okay, maybe I can see that one. "But your hair is like a flock of goats descending from the hills of Gilead." And then he says, "Your teeth are like a flock of sheep just shorn. Each one has a twin. You're not missing any teeth." That's what he says. And then he goes even further. He says, "Your neck is like the Tower of David, built with courses of stone, and on it hang 1,000 shields, of which the shields of all of them shields by warriors." Again, neck and tower, maybe. But then he says, "Your breasts are like two fawns, like twin fawns of a gazelle that browse among the lilies." And he goes further down. He just goes from top to bottom, and she does the same thing. It's crazy. It's not the way the image that we would use, but what we see here is that the Bible wants us to see that even after the fall, that sexuality between a husband and a wife is a good thing and a beautiful thing, and we need to honor it. He says in this text that in marriage, a husband and a wife commit themselves to each other, sexually to themselves. That's this language of fulfilling a duty. It doesn't sound very romantic, the way that he phrases it, but that's the point that he's trying to make. In a marriage, a husband and wife commit themselves sexually to each other. Now, in a patriarchal society, it was just assumed that this language that the husband had control over their wife's body was the way it was. They got to call the shots. They did oftentimes not so great things in the name of power and control because they could do whatever they want and they had that kind of influence. And so this language that Paul uses of that a wife should fulfill her duty or that the husband has authority over her body would have been assumed. But I want you to see how radical Paul is. Radical Paul is in his, because in that society it would have ended right there. But Paul says, no, marriage is a mutual thing. And he asserts that the wives have the same kind of control over their husbands' bodies. And so there's an equalness there that I want you to see that's there in sexuality in a marriage. And that's important for us to see. Now, it's also important for me to make a disclaimer here, because this passage was not intended to manipulate a spouse to get what you want. And unfortunately, I have heard situations where that's exactly it. They will ask a spouse to do things that they want them to do or to do things that make them feel uncomfortable or as a power game. That's not what this text is intended. This text is a reminder that sex isn't just about your needs, but also about the needs of your spouse. When Steph and I do premarital counseling, I tell the groom, I've got one job for you. And they're like, okay, what is it? Your job is to figure out what makes your wife tick. That's your job. And usually they're pretty excited to do it. But what we need to see is that oftentimes sex is about what can I get out of it? And what Paul says is that sex is a mutual thing. And our goal is to put the needs of our spouse there as well. And so when he talks about this language, that's what he's trying to get at, that sex is an important part of marriage, that God wired us to come together. It bonds us in a unique way. It can help us feel close to one another and create an intimacy there. And he says it's a place of mutuality where you look not only for your own self, but for the needs of your spouse as well. And that's the point that he's trying to make. Now, he even says that married people should not deprive each other or hold back from intimacy of all forms. Now, this speaks pretty bluntly to sex that can sometimes be used as a power game in marriage. It's like, I'm mad at you, so I'm going to withhold it or freeze you out or those kind of things. And it can go either way. But Paul says, no, it's good for a husband and wife to have sex together. It bonds you. It connects you on a deep level. And it's an important part. It's an important rhythm of marriage. And that you shouldn't deprive one another is the language. You shouldn't commit. You should commit to regular practice except by mutual consent. He says, except by mutual consent. Don't deprive each other except through mutual consent. Again, it highlights what I said. It's not a tool for one person to use as power against the other one. Rather, this is something you do together. And there may be a temporary season where it has to be done. He says that. He says, hey, do not deprive each other except for perhaps a mutual consent for a time. There may be times where you have to not have sex. Maybe you're in a spot where the health doesn't allow it. You're injured or there's things that are happening. Maybe you're in a tough spot. And the fact of the matter is that something triggered trauma that you had. In a room this size, and my guess is that we have lots of people who have gone through and have been abused. And that will mess our sexuality. And there may be times where something triggers it. And we have to restrain for a while that we can kind of process through it, meet with the counselor, or do those kind of things. There's all kinds of situations where maybe that might have to happen, but that's not the goal, or that's not the main thing that we need to do. But the purpose of all of this is that we draw closer to God. He says, if you do it so that you can devote yourselves to prayer. And part of that is even that God would work in our marriage. He'd help us create an intimacy, not just a sexual intimacy, but all kinds of intimacy. This is the goal. Now, he says that this is also to help fight temptation. Now, in this one, it's easy to look at this and say, because Paul is just talking about sex, that he's thinking about sexual temptation. But I think it's bigger than that. Again, if we think about it in just those kind of terms, then we're kind of falling into the dualistic idea that the Greeks had, that it's just a physical thing. Sex is more than that. It's an emotional bond. It's a spiritual bond. And so when we come together with our spouse, it creates a closeness and an intimacy. And so it's not just a physical temptation, but also it can open our marriage to all kinds of other things that can break it down. And so he's saying it's important rhythm of our lives. and we need to be careful about it. Now you guys are like, oh, that's a lot to take in, and it is. So what do we do with all of this? Well, I think the one thing that I hope that we see is that our sexual desires are designed by God. And if you're a young person here today, I know this is probably awkward, okay? But I want you to hear that it's okay for you to be curious about it. It's okay for you to have feelings, and that it's okay. My one thing I would tell you is talk to a trusted adult rather than trusting the internet, okay? Now, I'd say that about pretty much anything and everything for all of us. But I think it's okay for us I want you to know that it's okay for you to have a crush or to like somebody, and that is a normal part of life. And yes, it's awkward, and maybe even your parents may have talks with you that are awkward, but we want you to know that it's designed by God. If you're single, I want you to know that it's okay to have those longings. It's okay. It's okay to feel those desires for a spouse or to be able to be physically intimate with somebody. It's not a bad thing. It's a good thing. Now, we have to learn how to keep them in check and deal with those kind of things, but ultimately our sexual desire is a good thing. It says, too, I think we got to break this stereotype. You know, Paul talks about male and female and all this, and often in our society, it's like men are the only ones with a sexual desire. But Paul says, no, we all are wired, and that's okay. And so it's okay for us to have that. And so I want us to see that our sexual desires are designed by God. I also want us to see that married couples should strive to have a healthy sex life, okay? It takes work. We're tired. We're busy, especially when we have kids and all these different things. And oftentimes, this is something that's easily overlooked. But I think we miss the power of the way that God wired us and the power of sexuality, that it's not just a physical thing. There's an emotional connection and a spiritual connection. And so it's important for us to make time. I think we also need to fight that stereotype that our society has, that married sex is the worst sex of all. And it's if you want to kill everything and all your fun, then you know what? Just get married. And do you know that studies actually show that's not, that the way that it's talked about is not the case. I honestly didn't go Googling for new studies because I thought, oh boy, what world is that going to bring up in my thing? But back when I did abstinence talks, and actually Laura Winter quotes the same study that I used to, said that back in 1994, the University of Chicago did a study on sexuality, and the interesting thing that they found is that those who were married and were committed to one another actually communicated a higher level of pleasure and fulfillment with sexuality. And so we have to take that narrative back in a church to say, you know what? It's okay for us to have a healthy sexuality, and that's an okay thing. And so I think it's important for us. But I think there's something even deeper here that we can wrestle with. There's a uniting that happens with sexuality, and in a marriage where a loving marriage that's not focused on their own selves, but also focused on other, there's a big picture thing. And it's not me who makes this up. Actually, Paul says this. In Ephesians 5, he says, for this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. And then you're like, okay, he's going to go into more talks about husbands and wives, which in that whole passage he does. It's about this is what you should do, wives, and this is what you should, husband, do. And then he says, but wait, this is a profound mystery. But I'm talking about Christ in the church. And then he says, however, each one of you must love his own wife as he loves himself, and the wife must respect her husband. And I think what he's saying here is that the vulnerability that we have with one another shows us the closeness that we can have with Christ. And when we love one another and we don't make marriage or even sexuality just about ourselves, but rather about the other person, there's something that happens. And hopefully that when people see our marriages and they see that we engage with one another, that they see that there is a love of Christ and that we can reveal that to other people. And that even in this, that we can see the openness and vulnerability that we have with our spouse it reveals a glimpse of the closeness that we can have with Christ. But as with anything, I think it's important for us to remember also that Christ's grace is greater than any sin, and that His Holy Spirit can transform us. Because we all come with different sexual baggages, and we all come from different life experiences. As I said, for some of us, it's not even our own actions. It's unfortunately the actions that have been done to us. And they can mess with things. And so for those of us who maybe have sinned, I want us to know that, remind us that God's grace is greater than any sin that we can have, including sexual sins. And for those of us who've wrestled with things and maybe have been abused and we feel the weight of all of this, I want us to also say this, that His Spirit can transform us. Yes, it's painful and it hurts us at a core in a way that, quite frankly, other things may not. And it can feel like it's a chain and it's a burden. If that's you, I want to encourage you to be honest about what's happened to you, not so that you dredge up pain from the past, but that you can bring it to light and see a trusted counselor. We can definitely help you with that here. But for all of us, I want us to know that Christ's Spirit can transform us and He can help us grow. And so no matter where we're at on our journey or what we're wrestling with, those two truths are important for us to remember. That Christ's grace is greater than any sin, and no matter what our struggles are, whether it's because of really hurtful and harmful things that people have done to us, or whether it's because of even poor choices we've made ourselves, that God's Spirit can transform us, and that's the hope that we have. So as Christians, we don't have to be prudish Puritans who think that sex is bad. We can enjoy it in the context of a husband and wife, and we can see that it's a great thing for us to bond together. But as always, we remember Christ's grace is at work in our lives, and He can even help us form intimacy as a couple, whether it just be physical or emotional or in all kinds of things, and help us grow in our faith with Him. Let's pray.
You have just watched a sermon from Crossway Church in Battleground, Washington. We hope that you enjoyed it, and we'd love to have you come join us for a worship service on Sunday at 10 a.m. at 311 North Parkway Avenue in Battleground, Washington. If you'd like to find more information about us online, you can find it at crosswaychurchwa.com.